Most people call the police when someone blocks their garage. But when an arrogant HOA Karen decided my driveway was her personal parking spot, I didn't call the cops. I went to the hardware store. I built a solid fence right around her precious SUV, locked the gate, and immediately left for a 2-week vacation. She thought her HOA power trip made her untouchable until she realized her car was officially in prison and the HOA board wouldn't help her. Here is exactly how standing up to a neighborhood bully ended in the ultimate sweetest revenge. I pulled into my driveway on a Thursday evening after a 12-hour shift at the hospital to find a massive black Cadillac Escalade parked directly across my garage door. Not near it, not sort of blocking it, completely blocking it. My name is Robert. I'm 34 years old. I work as an ER nurse, which means I work rotating shifts. I'm exhausted most of the time, and when I finally get home after dealing with trauma and chaos and people at their absolute worst, I want exactly one thing: to park my car in my garage, walk into my house, and collapse. That's it. That's the dream. I bought my house in Riverside Glen 2 years ago. It's a small development, maybe 40 homes, mostly young families and retirees, quiet streets, shared green spaces, the kind of place where people actually say good morning and mean it. My house is a corner lot, which I loved when I bought it because it meant more privacy, a bigger yard, and a driveway that wrapped around the side with direct access to my garage. The garage faces the side street, not the main road, which made it perfect for me. I could come and go without driving past everyone's front windows. I valued that privacy. I needed it. When I moved in, I met my neighbors. The family directly next to me, the Parkers, were lovely. 2 kids, a dog, always friendly. The couple across the street, Margaret and Bill, were retired and sweet. They brought me a casserole the first week. And then there was Diane. Diane lived in the house that backed onto the side street where my garage was. Her driveway was on the main road, but her backyard fence ran parallel to the side street, right across from my garage. She was in her early 50s, drove the black Escalade I mentioned, and had the kind of personality that filled a room before she even entered it. Loud, confident, the type of woman who laughed at her own jokes and expected you to laugh too. I met her about a week after I moved in. She knocked on my door holding a bottle of wine and introduced herself with a hug I hadn't invited. She talked for 45 minutes about the neighborhood, about her job in real estate, about her son who was in college, about the HOA which she was very involved in, and about how great it was to have another single woman on the block. I smiled and nodded and thanked her for the wine, and when she finally left, I realized I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with work. Diane was, and I'm choosing my words carefully here, a lot. She was the kind of person who assumed familiarity. She'd wave at me from across the street and yell questions about my day. She'd text me, I still don't know how she got my number, about neighborhood events I hadn't signed up for. She invited herself over twice in the first month, once to borrow sugar, which I'm certain she didn't actually need, and once to ask if I wanted to go to a wine tasting that weekend. I politely declined both times. I wasn't trying to be rude, I just didn't have the energy for forced friendship. The parking situation started about 6 months after I moved in. I came home one afternoon and Diane's Escalade was parked on the side street directly in front of my garage, not blocking it exactly, just in front of it, taking up the curb space. It was a public street, so technically she could park there. It was annoying but not illegal. I didn't say anything. The next week it happened again, and then again. And then one day I came home and the Escalade wasn't just in front of my garage, it was angled in a way that made it nearly impossible for me to pull into my driveway without a 12-point turn. I sat there in my car for a minute, exhausted, frustrated, and I thought about knocking on her door. But I didn't want conflict, I just wanted to park. I maneuvered my car in barely and went inside. The next morning I left a polite note on her windshield. Hi Diane, I know street parking is public, but when you park in front of my garage it makes it really difficult for me to access my driveway. Would you mind parking in front of your own house instead? Thanks so much, Robert. The note disappeared. The parking continued. In fact, it got worse. Now the Escalade was there almost every day, and it wasn't just in front of my garage anymore. It was blocking it, fully blocking it. I'd come home from a shift and I couldn't get into my own garage. I'd have to park on the street, walk around, and haul my bag and my exhaustion up to my front door like some kind of vagrant in my own neighborhood. I knocked on her door twice. The first time she answered and I explained the situation calmly. She smiled and said, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, I didn't even realize, I'll totally move it." She didn't move it. The second time she said her driveway was being used by her son who was home from college and she just needed the street spot temporarily. Temporarily became permanently. I called the non-emergency police line. They said since it was a public street and she wasn't violating any parking laws, there was nothing they could do unless she was blocking a fire hydrant or a marked no parking zone. My garage door didn't count. I went to the HOA, I filed a complaint. The HOA sent her a letter asking her to be considerate of neighbor access. She ignored it. The HOA sent a second letter. She ignored that too. I was told that unless there was a specific covenant violation, which there wasn't, the HOA couldn't force her to move her car from a public street. I was stuck, and Diane knew it. I could see it in the way she smiled at me now when we passed each other. It wasn't friendly anymore, it was smug. She'd won some game I didn't know I was playing and she was enjoying it. That Thursday evening when I came home to find the Escalade parked so close to my garage door that I could barely see the paint, I sat in my car and I made a decision. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to leave another note. I wasn't going to beg her to be a decent human being. I was going to solve this my way. I went inside. I made dinner. I sat down with my laptop and I started researching. Specifically, I researched property lines, easements, and what I was legally allowed to do on my own land. My driveway, my garage, and the small strip of grass between my driveway and the side street were all on my property. I'd confirmed this when I bought the house. The property survey was clear. The side street was public. The curb was public. But everything behind the curb, including the 3 feet of grass that ran along the edge of my driveway, was mine. I looked into fencing regulations. The city allowed property owners to install fencing on their own land provided it didn't obstruct sight lines at intersections and didn't exceed 6 feet in height. My property wasn't near an intersection. A fence along my driveway wouldn't obstruct anything. I called a fencing company the next morning. A guy named Steve came out that afternoon. I walked him along the property line and explained what I wanted. A simple fence 4 feet high running along the edge of my property between my driveway and the side street. It didn't need to be fancy, it just needed to be there. Steve looked at the Escalade parked in front of my garage. He looked at me, he grinned. "Someone giving you trouble?" he asked. "Something like that," I said. "I can have this done in 3 days. He said, "Perfect." I said, "I didn't tell Deanne, I didn't tell anyone." On Monday morning, Steve and his crew arrived at 7 a.m. By noon, they'd marked the property line, dug the post holes, and started installing the fence. It was a nice fence, white vinyl, clean, exactly 4 feet tall, running the full length of my driveway from the sidewalk to the back corner of my property. Diane's Escalade was parked on the street as usual, blocking my garage as usual. The fence went up around it. Not touching it, the fence was on my property and the Escalade was on the street, but the effect was immediate and obvious. The fence now separated the side street from my driveway completely. There was no longer any visual or physical connection between the street parking and my garage. My driveway was enclosed, protected, mine. By Tuesday afternoon, the fence was finished. It looked great. Steve handed me the final invoice and I paid him with the kind of satisfaction I hadn't felt in months. I took a photo of the fence with the Escalade sitting on the other side of it, blocked from view, irrelevant, and I saved it to my phone. Wednesday morning, I had a day shift. When I left the house, the Escalade was still there. When I came home that evening, it was gone. In its place was Diane standing on the sidewalk staring at my new fence with her hands on her hips. I pulled into my driveway, my beautiful newly enclosed driveway, and got out of my car. Diane turned to look at me. "What is this?" she said, pointing at the fence. "It's a fence." I said, "I can see it's a fence, Robert. Why is it here?" "Because it's my property," I said. "I'm allowed to fence my property." "This is ridiculous," she said. "You put up a fence to block me from parking on the street." "I put up a fence to enclose my driveway," I said. "Where you park is up to you. The street's still public. You can park there if you want. You just can't see my garage anymore." Her face was red now. "You did this on purpose." "I did this because I'm tired of coming home and not being able to access my own garage." I said, "You could have just talked to me," she said. I stared at her. I stared at her for a long moment because I genuinely could not believe she'd just said that. "I left you a note," I said slowly. "I knocked on your door twice. I asked you politely to stop blocking my garage. You ignored me, so yes, I did this on purpose." She sputtered. She actually sputtered. "I'm calling the HOA," she said. "Go ahead," I said. "The fence is on my property." I checked. I walked past her into my garage and closed the door behind me. I stood there in the silence of my own space and I smiled. Diane did call the HOA. The HOA sent someone to verify the fence was on my property, which it was, and to confirm it met city regulations, which it did. They sent me a letter saying the fence was compliant and required no further action. They sent Diane a letter saying the same thing. She didn't park in front of my garage anymore. She parked in front of her own house. Problem solved. Except Diane wasn't the type of person to let things go. Over the next 2 weeks, she made her feelings very clear. She glared at me whenever she saw me. She made loud comments to other neighbors about property spite and hostile behavior. She left a printed copy of an article about neighborly conflict resolution taped to my front door. I threw it away. Then one morning I checked my work schedule and realized I had something coming up that I'd been looking forward to for months, 2 weeks of vacation. I'd requested it back in January, long before any of this started, and I was planning to spend it visiting my sister in Colorado. 2 full weeks away from the hospital, away from the chaos, away from Riverside Glen. Away from Diane, and that's when I had an idea. A beautiful, petty, perfect idea. The fence I'd installed had a gate, a small gate at the end of the driveway near the sidewalk that I could use to access the side street if I needed to take out trash or recycling. The gate had a lock, a simple padlock that I'd installed mostly out of habit. But what if I made one small addition to my property before I left for Colorado? What if I made it very clear that my driveway, my garage, and everything inside that fence was absolutely and completely off limits? I went to a hardware store. I bought a heavy-duty chain and a second padlock. I bought 2 large signs, bright yellow, that said private property, no trespassing. I installed the signs on the fence, one on each side of the gate. I wrapped the chain through the gate and locked it with both padlocks. Then I did something else. Something I'd been thinking about since the day the fence went up. I called a storage company and had them deliver a portable storage pod. One of those big metal containers people use when they're moving. I had them place it in my driveway right up against the fence, directly in the spot where someone standing on the side street would have the best view of my garage. The pod was enormous. It blocked the entire sight line. You couldn't see my garage at all anymore. You couldn't see anything except a big blue storage container and a locked gate and 2 signs that said no trespassing. I didn't need the storage pod. I wasn't moving. I wasn't storing anything. I just wanted it there. The storage company said I could rent it by the week. I rented it for 2 weeks. It cost me $300. It was worth every penny. I left for Colorado on a Saturday morning. I locked my house, locked my gate, double-checked the storage pod, and drove to the airport. My sister picked me up in Denver that afternoon, and we spent the next 2 weeks hiking and drinking wine and not thinking about Diane or Escalades or any of it. I did, however, think about it a little bit. Specifically, I thought about it every time my phone buzzed with a notification from my doorbell camera. I'd installed the camera a few months earlier for security, and it had motion detection. It sent me alerts whenever someone approached my front door. I'd gotten used to ignoring most of them, delivery drivers, neighbors, the occasional cat, but during those 2 weeks in Colorado, I got 17 notifications. 15 of them were Diane. I watched the footage. She walked past my house multiple times. She stood at the fence looking at the storage pod. She tried the gate. She pulled on the chain. She took photos. On day 4, she knocked on my front door. On day 6, she knocked again and waited for almost 5 minutes. On day 9, she left a note tucked into my door frame. I couldn't read it from the camera angle, but I could see her writing it, folding it, and shoving it into the frame with more force than was necessary. I didn't respond to any of it. I was in Colorado. I was unreachable. I was having the time of my life. My sister asked me once why I was smiling at my phone so much. I showed her the doorbell footage. She watched Diane yank on the locked gate and she laughed so hard she cried. On day 12, I got a notification that wasn't from my doorbell camera. It was an email from the HOA. The subject line said complaint filed RE 247 Riverside Glen. That was my address. I opened the email. Diane had filed a formal complaint claiming that my storage pod was an eyesore, that it violated neighborhood aesthetic standards, and that it was blocking sight lines on the side street, which she claimed was a safety issue. I forwarded the email to my sister. She read it and said, "Is she serious? Completely serious?" I said. I wrote back to the HOA. I explained that the storage pod was temporary, that it was on my private property, and that I'd be removing it when I returned from vacation in 2 days. I attached a copy of my rental agreement with the storage company showing the return date. I also noted politely that the pod was not blocking any sight lines because it was behind my fence on my driveway and not on the street. The HOA wrote back saying they'd received my response and considered the matter resolved. They also noted that Diane had been reminded that filing complaints about temporary lawful uses of private property was not an appropriate use of the HOA complaint process. I smiled. I screenshot that email and saved it. I flew home 2 days later. I landed on a Tuesday afternoon, picked up my car from the airport lot, and drove back to Riverside Glen. The neighborhood looked exactly the same. The storage pod was still in my driveway exactly where I'd left it. The gate was still locked. The signs were still up. I parked on the street, unlocked the gate, walked into my driveway, and stood there for a moment just enjoying the sight of my own property, enclosed and secure and completely untouched by anyone but me. The storage company picked up the pod the next morning. I watched from my porch as they loaded it onto the truck and drove away. The driveway was empty again. The fence was still there. The gate was still locked, and Diane's Escalade was nowhere near my garage. I found the note she'd left on day 9. It was still tucked into my doorframe, a little crumpled from the weather. I unfolded it. It said, "Robert, your behavior is childish and hostile. We need to talk about this like adults. You can't just put up fences and storage containers to make a point. This neighborhood is supposed to be a community, Diane." I read it twice, then I folded it back up and threw it in the recycling bin. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. She'd made her point and I'd made mine, and my point had a lock on it. Diane stopped glaring at me after that. She didn't stop being annoyed. I could see it in her face whenever we passed each other, but she stopped trying to engage. She stopped parking on the side street entirely. She stopped knocking on my door. She stopped filing HOA complaints. 3 months later, she moved. I heard about it from Margaret across the street, who told me Diane had bought a bigger house in a different development across town. Margaret said it like it was good news, and I agreed that it was. The new neighbors who moved into Diane's house were a young couple with a toddler. They were quiet and kind, and they parked in their own driveway. My fence is still there. I never took it down. I like it. It makes my driveway feel like an actual part of my house instead of just a strip of asphalt anyone can look at. The gate stays locked most of the time. I open it when I need to, but otherwise it stays shut. I still work at the hospital. I still come home exhausted. But now when I pull into my driveway and hit the button to open my garage door, I do it with the quiet satisfaction of someone who solved her own problem, on her own terms, with her own fence. Diane taught me something important. She taught me that some people will take as long as you let them. They'll park in front of your garage and smile while they do it. They'll ignore your notes and your requests and your polite attempts at resolution because they don't respect you enough to care. And when you finally stop asking and start building, they'll call you childish. They'll call you hostile. They'll file complaints and leave notes and act like you're the problem. But here's the thing, you're not the problem. The fence isn't the problem. The problem was always the person who thought your property was theirs to use. I don't regret the fence. I don't regret the storage pod. I don't regret any of it. I regret that it took me so long to stop asking for basic respect and start enforcing it myself. But I learned. And my driveway, my beautiful fenced enclosed private driveway, is proof that sometimes the best way to deal with someone who won't listen is to stop talking and start building walls.